The honour member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to speak to this important agreement. I want to focus my comments on a few things. First of all, I've noticed in debate that there's been some insinuation that somehow reviewing this bill and its content is inappropriate for Parliament. But I do want to refer colleagues who are making that assertion to comments that were made actually earlier in debate, I think it was last week, by the member from South Okanagan, West Kootenay, where he talked about how in previous trade agreements that have come before the House, the government hasn't afforded Parliament a lot of time to review things. And he actually cited that the minister in February 2020, ahead of the U.S. renegotiated CUSMA agreement, made the following commitment to require that a notice of intent to enter into negotiation towards a new free trade agreement be tabled in the House of Commons at least 90 calendar days prior to the commencement of negotiations, and then to require objectives for notifications towards new free trade agreements to be tabled in the House of Commons at least 30 calendar days prior to the commencement of negotiations. Under normal parliamentary procedures, these objectives would be referred to the Committee on International Trade. As far as I understand, Madam Speaker, and I'm happy to be corrected, I don't believe that the government actually did that in this case, and that, is problematic. And I also think that, because the government has failed to do this, it is incumbent upon parliamentarians to take time to scrutinize this legislation. It does affect many different aspects of the economy, some in very positive ways, but our job here is to scrutinize legislation, and the assertion that somehow we shouldn't be doing that is actually anti-democratic, Madam Speaker. So I would hope that honourable colleagues refrain from that assertion and instead focus on the subject at hand today. And I also hope that if the government is going to enter into future negotiations such as this, that they abide by the rules that they have put forward to this place. It would make things a lot more productive, and it would be far more respectful of our time and parliamentarians' time here. Thank you. All right. So on to the subject of the agreement. I have two, I'd like to focus my comments on this bill for consideration in two key components. First of all is the concept of treatment of intangibles in free trade agreements. There was quite a bit of, I think, rightful concern about the government's lack of focus on how to treat intangibles in the previous Canada-US free trade agreement. And I think it's incumbent, and I would just implore colleagues, should this bill make it to committee, to be looking at this particular aspect in any free trade agreement, including this one. I want to read one passage just to put into the record for colleagues to consider as they're deliberating this bill, and it's it was a passage, I believe, read, it's by Jim Balsillie, Canadian industry leader, talking about intangibles and trade. So the instruments designed to govern the intangibles economy, including the New Age trade agreements such as CUSMA, CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, entrench and expand protections for owners of IP and data. However, he noted that this is not new. In the 1990s, he said trade agreements became the main tool for devising preferential marketplace frameworks that suit the owners of IP. He also says that nowhere was the shift from intangibles to intangibles set in sharper relief than with Canada's largest trading partner in the U.S. He goes on to later critique how Canada's woeful late recognition of the shift to intangibles and the failure to understand its significance for national prosperity and security resulted in its falling behind, walking into strategic errors, and now leaving it poised to enter the post-pandemic world, not only in just catch-up mode, but relegated to competing globally on the cost of its tech talent with low-wage jurisdictions. He talks about how Canada has an IP and intellectual property trade deficit, and that even his council's recommendation would have us paying even more rents out to IP owners who are principally foreign. this is something that I really hope colleagues will consider in their deliberations over this particular bill, particularly as Canada still lags behind the rest of the world in terms of dealing with artificial intelligence regulations. We are entering a phase, Madam Speaker, where our economy, the global economy, isn't just entering into a digital economy. It is not. It is in a digital economy and progressing into a generative economy. And when we just focus on widgets and tangibles as a primary focus of trade agreement, these other aspects like intellectual property protection, how data ownership, these are all things that if we promulgate them in our trade agreements without failure to thinking about the downstream impact 10, 15 years are on our economy, we are actually setting Canada's economic prospects behind. I'm not necessarily saying that's the case in this agreement, but I would just hope that parliamentarians who are tasked with looking at this agreement, particularly in the committee stage, would focus on precedent that's being set with regard to intangibles and intellectual property component, or with any other trade agreement. I think that's something that Parliament needs to be seized with. So just a note to colleagues who might be looking at that in the future. The other thing that I want to focus on, and I'm just trying to find the exact subsection here, it would be section 1310 of the trade agreement under subsection 8D, which says promote the rapid transition from unabated coal power to clean energy sources. So, Madam Speaker, this is a great laudable objective. I think that as previous colleagues have talked about in this House here, the provision of clean energy and reducing Ukraine, other European countries' reliance on Russia for energy, it should be an objective of the Canadian government. However, as other colleagues have pointed out, the government's own actions over the last 8 years have been antithetical to that posture. So it's very difficult for the government to make an assertion like this in a trade agreement after 8 years of failing to acknowledge that Canada has a duty to build out facilities to provide cleaner sources of energy, like liquefied natural gas, to other economies if they're going to make or take a posture like this in the trade agreement. The reality is that Canada's government has taken a posture that is against the development of this type of resource. And in fact, I would, Speaker, draw your attention to an article. It was in Reuters from October 6th of last year, so over a year ago. The Prime Minister, Canada's Prime Minister, under pressure from Conservative rival to back new LNG. So this article covered extensively what happened when German Chancellor Olaf Scholz came to Canada seeking a major role for Canada in replacing Russian supplies like energy. The rebuff that our allies in Europe got from this government was wholly inappropriate. And the fact that a year has gone by and we're now taking this posture in this trade agreement without having seen any movement forward from the government on how to increase this type of export in an environmentally sustainable way is wholly irresponsible. My colleague from Calgary Heritage earlier in his speech talked about how Canada's failure to provide, we have this resource in abundant supply. We have some of the strictest environmental controls in the world. Canada is actually remarkably well placed to develop this resource in an environmentally responsible manner. There are colleagues from all different parties who represent ridings that are part of the development of this resource. The fact that the government has not, I guess what I'm saying, Madam Speaker, is there's a bit of a cognizant dissonance between the posture that they've taken in 1310 of the trade agreement and the reality of building out this infrastructure. So I would encourage colleagues, as they consider this bill, as well as colleagues in the governing party, to look at ways to close that gap or to bring those two postures together. We can't be putting postures like this in a trade agreement with any sort of truth to it without building out that infrastructure. It's good for the Canadian economy, and it certainly would defund the Russian war machine. This is really important. This is something that this is a broader objective, and it would also provide stronger economic support for the country as well, too. I'll just close with this. Many colleagues in the House have pointed out in the debate over the Conservative motion on removing home heating tax that will be voted on Monday on how natural gas is a cleaner source of energy and we should be looking to displace it. I don't understand why that cognitive dissonance exists in other areas. Thank you, Madam Speaker.